Hi, everybody. This is Mr. Bishop, and welcome to our screencast for cell respiration, biochemical energy. This is going to be maybe a brief screencast. I just want to get this up for those of you who are ambitious in completing your homework or timely, and there might be a second version later to for you guys, or we might just catch up in the next screencast with some of the stuff. But I wanted to put this out for you. I read your exit slips today and found some really interesting questions that all of you had, and I hope to answer a lot of those questions during the course of the screencast. So, just to let you know some of the questions that you or your classmates may have asked. How do all of these definitions relate to each other? How many different types of amino acids are there? What happens if we didn't have carbohydrates? Why is a fatty acid called a fatty acid? Are they mitochondrion and mitochondria part of the same functions? What are molecules that are building blocks of proteins? It seems like several of us had trouble with that question on the discussion during the vocab. What is ATP? What's the difference between endothermic and exothermic? What is reduction in a cell? What does glucose do? Why do molecules have long chains and what chains? What else does the cytoplasm have? How does our body create lactic acid? How do all of these definitions relate to each other? What does catabolic mean? And what potential energy of food molecules? So, a lot of really good questions, and hopefully we can answer them over the course of these screencasts. In case you missed the vocabulary in class, if you missed a word or you were not there, here is our vocabulary as it relates to cellular respiration. So that answers one of our questions, which was how do all these terms relate to one another. All these terms are important to our understanding of cellular respiration. And moving forward, we'll give you a little bit more time and we'll read through these once. Starting up at the top left, respiration, anaerobic, aerobic, carbohydrate, glucose, amino acid, fatty acid, pyruvate, Krebs cycle, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, hydrolysis, oxidation, reduction, catabolism, exothermic, endothermic, glycolysis, fermentation, electron transport chain, mitochondrion, cytoplasm, lactic acid, and adenosine triphosphate. So, first slide, let's review the mitochondria or mitochondrion. So let's answer another question. Is there any relation between mitochondrion and mitochondria? And yes, they are in fact the same thing. Mitochondrion is a single mitochondrion, while mitochondria are several mitochondrion. Mitochondrion is the singular of the word, and mitochondria is the plural of the word. So mitochondria are shaped perfectly to maximize their productivity, which is to drive cellular respiration, provide energy to the cell. They are made of two membranes, the outer membrane, which you can see, the brown shell, and which covers the organelle and contains it like a skin, and the inner membrane, which has folds over many times and creates layered structure called cristae. And these cristae are critical to a step in the electron transport chain, which is our latter step of cellular respiration. And the fluid contained in the mitochondria is called the matrix, which is where the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle takes place. Additionally, in this image, you can see that ATP synthase particles are labeled, which are important enzymes of cellular respiration. They are what drive our Krebs cycle and our citric acid cycle, as well as deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA, which the mitochondrion is unique in that it is an organelle with its own unique DNA separate from the rest of our cells, which is contained in our nucleus, as well as ribosomes that take that mitochondrial DNA and create the structures needed for the mitochondria. Mitochondria are membrane-enclosed organelles distributed through the cytosol or the cytoplasm. Those are two terms that are also interchangeable. To some extent, cytosol is the empty space of the cytoplasm of most eukaryotic cells. Their number within the cells range from a few hundred to, in very active cells, thousands. Their main function is the conversion of the potential energy of food molecules into ATP. Again, mitochondria have an outer membrane that encloses the entire structure, an inner membrane that encloses a fluid-like matrix. Between the two is the intermembrane space. The inner membrane is elaborately folded with shelf-like cristae projecting into the matrix, which is our inner fluid, and a small number of circular molecules of DNA. And here, adenosine triphosphate, which will answer another question. What is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It is otherwise known as ATP. It is the major energy source of the cell. Provides most of the energy for energy-consuming activities of the cell. ATP regulates our biochemical pathways. When the third phosphate group of ATP is removed by water, a substantial amount of energy is released. We can see the chemical structure of ATP over to the right. We've got the adenine group, we've got a ribose group, and then we've got the 3-phosphate groups, and the 3-phosphate is what makes it a triphosphate. We'll get into a discussion a little bit later about adenosine diphosphate, which has 2. So triphosphate has 3, diphosphate has 2. ATP is a nucleotide that performs many essential roles in the cell. It is the major energy currency of the cell, providing the energy for most of the energy-consuming activities of the cell. It regulates many biochemical pathways. So, our last bullet point, when the third phosphate group of AT is removed by water, that process is called ATP hydrolysis. So, through hydrolysis, the removal of the third phosphate group by water, ATP becomes adenosine diphosphate. Now there's our diphosphate, or ADP. Approximately 7.3 kcals per mole of ATP of energy is released. Now, another good question was what potential energy of food molecules was asked on our exit slips, and what it is commonly misconceived, or what we consider potential energy in food, is the calorie content. Calorie is a measure of energy, and I don't want to get too into the physics of it, but potential energy is the amount of energy something contains that could potentially be used. Kinetic energy is energy in use. So potential energy, when you look at a food label and you see the nutrition facts panel and you see something that has 130 calories, that's how much energy is in that food. And the amount of calories is dependent upon the grams of the macromolecules, which our 3 major macromolecules are protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So depending on the grams of carbohydrates, fats, or protein, it has so many calories of potential energy. So ATP hydrolysis is the reaction by which chemical energy that has been stored in the high energy phosphoanhydride bonds in adenosine triphosphate, that's the high energy bonds between the phosphate groups, is released, for example, in muscles by producing work in the form of mechanical energy. So when we lift something or we're writing with our pencil, that is us using our calories. That's why we burn calories. That is mechanical energy. That's energy being used. So we've eaten food. We have energy stores in our body in the forms of fat and glycogen. And when we need to use that energy, our body burns it. When the third phosphate group of ATP is removed by hydrolysis, a substantial amount of free energy is released. The exact amount depends on the conditions, but we'll use the value of 7.3 kcals per mole in this discussion. Because of the substantial amount of energy liberated when it is broken, the bond between the second and third phosphates is commonly described as a high energy bond. Cells contain a wide variety of enzymes called ATPases, which we talked about in our diagram of our mitochondria, that catalyze the hydrolysis of ATP and couple the energy release to particular energy-consuming reactions in the cell. Cellular respiration. So one of you asked, what does catabolic mean? So catabolic is catabolism. It's the set of metabolic pathways, cellular respiration, that breaks down molecules into smaller units that are oxidized to release energy or used in other anabolic reactions. Catabolism breaks down large molecules such as carbohydrates, fats, and proteins into smaller units, such as glucose, or fatty acids, or amino acids, respectively. Cellular respiration is the process of oxidizing food molecules like glucose to carbon dioxide and water. The energy released is trapped in the form of ATP for use by all the energy-consuming activities of the cell. So one of you asked what would happen if we didn't have carbohydrates, and what does glucose do? So glucose our bodies use glucose as its main form of energy. More specifically, muscles are able to store glucose and use it when needed. When we're running or we're playing football or we're cheerleading, glucose is what our body breaks down our food into for use as energy. And catabolism is the metabolic series of reactions that break our food down into very small molecules. More importantly, the brain and other nerve cells survive solely on glucose. The brain doesn't have fat in it in our skull. It's just brain matter, and the only energy source that it has is glucose. Plus, they don't have reserves like muscles do, so you can imagine what would happen if those supplies are not maintained. So if we didn't have carbohydrate, we have evolved over millions and billions of years to digest carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So if we didn't have carbohydrates, we essentially would have some other we would have adapted for some other nutrient source. But so we wouldn't exist as we do today if carbohydrates didn't exist. And glucose is essential to the energy processes of our cells. So here we have a chemical formula, and I don't want you to get caught up in the chemistry of it, but we have C6H12O6, which is glucose. That's the chemical formula of glucose, plus 6O2, which is oxygen, and that reaction yields 6 CO2, carbon dioxide, and 6 water, H2O, plus energy in the form of heat and ATP. So what's the difference between endothermic and exothermic is one of the questions that was asked in class. This is an exothermic reaction. Heat is released. Exothermic reactions result in a net loss of heat. While endothermic reaction, heat goes into the reaction. It drives the reaction forward. The reaction absorbs the heat. Photosynthesis is a good example of an endothermic reaction. And just cells derive energy from carbohydrates, lipids, and protein in the form of glucose. And we'll move that formula up to the top. I want you guys to be familiar with that formula, and we'll just keep it up there. So, cellular respiration, it occurs in 3 stages. Glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid, the complete oxidation of pyruvic acid to carbon dioxide and water. In eukaryotes, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol. The remaining process takes place in our mitochondria or mitochondrion. So occurs in 3 stages. Glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid. That is an anaerobic reaction. No oxygen is required. The Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, is an aerobic reaction. Oxygen is required for that reaction. And the electron transport chain occurs in the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's where our cristae come into play. The Krebs cycle is in our matrix, in our eukaryotes, which are more complex cellular organisms. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, which is in the cytoplasm. And the remaining plays, the Krebs and the electron transport chain, take place in the mitochondria. All right, that's 15 minutes. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening. Hopefully we'll get through all the questions that were asked.